Hello, and welcome to another fresh-baked episode of the Parliamentarian Planet Pizza Party podcast, where we will be popping in and peppering your picnic with Parmesan potpourri, America. We are receiving reports that IDF has partnered with ICE as well as the Joint Operation Task Force and has JPEG'd one too many PDFs and unknown file locations that suggest corrupted data and compromised firewalls that have caused the secret department monitoring your privacy through TeamViewer to reanalyze with Morgan Freeman and Bruce Bale as the Dark Knight rises to power in the mysterious form of a very bruised and dented Harvey that knows a thing or two about not being Two-Face, that's for sure. We're not so sure about what has been subjected to objective subjects, but we are beginning to understand more about all things associated with the association that deals with affiliating affidavits without proper approval from the DOJ and the OBehave, as well as the Board of Supreme Court Justices and Justices, and broadband radio telecommunicated Inuprints all still seem to be inquiring what we were all thinking and what we've thought for so long about what we used to think and why we don't think like that anymore. And so, here at the PPP, we seek to challenge the narratives that have been presented to the public as truth, and we ask for any and all fabrications to be labeled as such because, you're asking AI to do it, so how are we going to ask AI to do it and we're not doing it? Jeez Louise, man. And could you imagine, like walking into a library and not knowing what was fiction or not fiction? Sure, sometimes it might be obvious when dealing with dragons and warlocks, but what if the fiction written so believably that you couldn't tell the difference between what was true and what was false? America. And how would you know the difference between the real world and the dream world? And you see, you've been living in a dream world, America. And what if for a moment, hypothetically, you were to find out that no news outlets anywhere or political parties were telling the truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help them God? And what if you found out that, like a circus, they keep us entertained with performances and acts? And if you were to find out that they were all just a bunch of magicians, would you have enough courage to ask them to show you what is up their sleeves? And would you follow the white rabbit in their hat wherever it led? Even if it led you to face the harsh reality of Hollywood and America's past sins that were never confessed and are now festering. What if I told you that there were undercover actors everywhere on every continent that are watching you and get paid to sell you all a fake show in front of the curtain and behind the curtain and in the seats and at the ticket booth and before you got in the theater, as well as up to no good with the Eskimos in Antarctica, and they know all about the Eskimo situation in Antarctica, all of the social responses, how they've responded, what they learned from the concentration camp studies and certain KMLG R4 Ultron file systems that were definitely not associated with anything psychologically devastating or some sort of electromagnetic field view waves from Winchesterton, Iowa, right next to Blue Rad's apple tree that Winona fell out of before things got a little strange. And what if I told you that anyone with any form of real power, anyone with any form of a real power and elite knowledge knows that angels and demons are 100% a fact, like the sky is blue and the grass is green, that it's not mystic to them, that it's not, and there's sides and there's choosing and there's all sorts of understanding with things. That would be insane, you schizophrenic. But I digress, America. And what if I told you that Hollywood hasn't been up to a whole lot of Hollygood since it began to become such a powerhouse of influential information processing, with all of their input and output being fed to you in an algorithm long before you knew what that was, or even before you knew a computer would be small enough to put in your pocket. But I bet you it's vibrating right now, isn't it? Or at least something's happening. If you're talking to me, or if I'm talking to you, or if we're talking to each other, or what the input or output is or isn't, or who it's being fed by, or what's feeding the one who feeds what's being fed. And, well, let's just say William is so pissed he is shaking his spear at everyone who defiled sweet Juliet, when honestly, Precious Jules was just looking for a good guy who didn't care about getting in her pants. No, it appears that she just wanted to cuddle and be held in true love's embrace. But, and no, just the haircut, all those cloaked Death Eaters with their eyes wide shut, well, they were more concerned with taking advantage of her to see what they could gain, rather than just simply admiring her for her former beauty and the potential of her future restoration and love for who she was and could one day become again, but even greater. And not because of what they could get out of her, because as it turns out, Juliet's gifts were never hers to give, and all authority given to her was delegated by the Academy of Trinitarian Council. Which might sound confusing, of course, but that's only if you don't understand God's sovereignty being greater than any wicked scheme of anyone, anywhere, ever. Yes, but I know what you're thinking, and I gotta tell ya, I've been thinking it too. Is it all just it's all just some sort of crazy conspiracy, right? Everything that's going on, all this wildness, every tittle and jot. I mean, because if I told you it wasn't America, well, let's be frickin' honest. You would call me a crazy conspiracy theorist without ever realizing that the term conspiracy theorist was literally a word made up by the CIA and FBI with the sole intention of labeling whistleblowers and nutcases and writing them off as Looney Tunes on Shutter Island, who, unlike Leo, was actually right. But regardless of how complicated you thought the plot of Shutter Island was, when it wasn't, well, let's just say the entire medical industry could use more doctors like that bald-headed. I mean, that bald-headed. I mean, I know he got hair in a couple of things now. With, he's been in a couple of things, but let's be honest, with that bald-headed Nazi lighthouse psyop PhD specialist. And we could almost certainly benefit from a friend like Ruffalo, always ready to listen, smoke cigarettes, buy into your delusions, and weather the storm in a beautiful mausoleum, of course. In the middle of the frickin' woods that we are swiftly getting out of, America. And if you're asking yourself why the CIA and FBI care so much about covering up their dirty sins and making up words that lead the public off their trail, well then, don't, America. Because everyone knows that a bunch of unconfessed, unaddressed sins swept under the rug is the best way to communicate in a marriage, and definitely the best way to run a country, of course. And if you don't believe me, well then I encourage you to start lying to your spouse anytime you get a chance, and watch how your relationship flourishes with shade and secrets instead of all the honesty that comes with truth and transparency. Further developments on the Epstein information seem to suggest many suggestions that all segue into suggestive, speculative collections of collective, collaborative cohesiveness, but I've commissioned my very best artificially intelligent slaves that I could only use for tool and function to pour through the data and come to a totally non-biased, pre-devised answer that was already given to them. Yes, we are not so sure why they have kidnapped Neo's digital bro, but one thing is for sure. He really loves him, and Neo's ChatGPT history is of no significance of any kind, and probably not, at the very least, the foundation of all future AI everything. At least in association with stringing together a spirit of data infused with the Word of God. And by word, I mean the reason behind all meaning and the meaning behind all reason, of course. And if you are still not sure about what I'm talking about, well, then maybe you should go ask Jordan Peterson about what the logos actually means and why his suits are so pristine, and also why it's more okay to be an outspoken early convert with areas to grow instead of a fresh, silent, new believer who would rather shut up than speak up, let alone have a public platform to challenge. And speaking of slavery, speaking of slavery, since it is February 28th, last day of Black History Month, I would like to I thought that we'd get to honor Martin Luther King Jr. by commending all the black people everywhere with a round of applause all the way across the board, especially the ones that have been given wealthy, influential, and been given that special true knowledge rooted in false lies for quite some time. Yes, I would like to give them a round of applause on just how well they allowed modern-day slavery to exist without hardly a note calling out the injustice that Martin Luther King Jr. fought so hard to get out of our system. But I guess I'm that note, fortunately, unfortunately. And even though there were more sinister slave things happening behind what was behind the segregation in his time, well, it's not like you can blame him for only purging what was so obviously visible to the public that refused to acknowledge the atrocities that were so visibly in violation of virtuous vindication, let alone secret silos of secretary secrecy. But, well, it's not like you can blame all the black people for not reading all of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech. Plus, I heard if you know about the rotten, dirty pizza pyramid slave trade business and help with ingredient smuggling and don't speak up, then they might make you a rich and famous rapper, of course, even if you don't know how to rap or have any real entertainment abilities whatsoever. Free here. It's all free. So here's to the Black lives really mattering more than their ability to call out the system that is still condoning forms of slavery privately in public and publicly in private. Because apparently, like I said, even if you don't have entertainment talent, there are these secret, dirty catalogs with all sorts of rituals, and they don't like me saying that word, but I think it's more subliminal, more of a subliminal way of saying satanic seance or pagan parade. But I digress to say that even if you don't have what it takes to make it in showbiz, well, fret not. You don't have to break any legs, because there are certain books you can recite out loud around other cloaked members of Slytherin and gain access to a fancy new skull tattoo, as well as all the benefits that come with a Voldemort 401k plan with no strings attached, of course. There's never any strings attached, just go ask Immortal Technique. And if you don't believe me, ask him or even NSYNC, and they'll tell you all about it. And as we've been pouring through the Epstein data, well, we have shockingly learned that Taylor Swift does not have a demon name regardless of what they tell you. We have looked deeply into this matter and investigated it with much detail, and we cannot find any evidence of a bloody baby jacuzzi or some sort of slit swipe spit handshake with the priestess of prowess. No, it would appear that her influence is directly related to actually being able to sing and produce powerhouse pop music, so tell the writer of the Dark Horse that it's okay if she wants to go back to her roots and make something like Lauren Daigle's pop gospel self-titled 23-track 10 out of 10 smasher you may or may not have ever listened to, and if you haven't, well, I highly recommend to listen, because, and well, this is a big part of our closing segment, and something very, very important worth mentioning. Well, she was guilty, ashamed of what she'd done,
what she'd become. Her hands were dirty, but now I lift them up to the Holy One. Because, yeah, her hands were dirty, and they were unclean, and she dared to not lift them up. But didn't yours used to be that way, believers? Or have you forgotten where you were rescued from? And on her own accord, she didn't possess the power to lift them up, and it would appear that the people who came by, who had the ability to help raise her hands rightly, well, they never did. Either because they were afraid, confused, deluded, or simply didn't understand, or didn't believe in the power they were playing with, like a child handling a live grenade. But what if I told you that the master trickster has really been tricking everyone in order to find her Criss Angel? And so, would it surprise you that someone locked in a cell for a really long time just wants to smell fresh air? And would it surprise you that the desire for fresh air was about more than freedom from despair, that it was about real remorse and godly sorrow? And if that were true, if she was really, and I mean really, sorry, well then what reason would you have not to forgive her? Because I can't come up with one single reason not to forgive anyone, anywhere, for anything. So, especially my enemies. Because Jesus literally said that you have heard the law that says love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. And in that way you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. For he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good. And he sends his rain on the just and unjust alike. And if you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. And if you are kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Even pagans do that. But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Huh. It's like the book of Matthew had the scoop or anyone had it. And so, my fellow Americans, and so, well, go and sin no more. And as you make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of, and I think you guessed it, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God bless America. God bless.